right. It's time for us to go and get started this morning. It's good to see each and every one of you. We're very thankful for your presence. If you are visiting with us, we want you to, if you could, fill out a visitor card. There is a QR code you can scan on the screen or on the back of the pew, or there is also a yellow gold visitor card that you can fill out also. We'd love to have a record of your attendance. It is definitely good to be with you all. It's good to see each and every one of you. I do want to remind you that next week, and we'll have some more announcements about this later, but next week we're going to be having our combined service with our Hispanic congregation. So Bible class will be normal, but our worship service, I am so sorry, brother, just smacking people. That's what you get for being late. I'm just kidding. But our worship service will be normal. Okay, I mean our Bible class will be normal, but our worship service will be translated, and Minor and his son Minor will be here for our sermon for next Sunday. So we're looking forward to that. And then following our Sunday morning service, we're going to have a fellowship meal. All of us together, the Hispanic congregation and the English-speaking congregation, as one congregation, and so we look forward to that too. Make sure you get a copy of the bulletin. There's many other announcements, including that announcement in there, and as far as about things that you can help provide as far as food and things for the fellowship meal. So all of that is in the bulletin. So please take a look at that. And there was a flock note that was also sent out about that too. I think that's all the announcements that I wanted to cover, and some of those things will be covered again in just a little bit. Before we begin with class this morning, let's go ahead and let's start with a word of prayer. Our gracious Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the beautiful sunshine outside. We're thankful for the opportunity we have to gather together inside of this building and to be able to study from your word together. Father, we pray that you help us as we look into your word. Help us to strive to follow after the things that we read about, that we learn from there. We are thankful that you have given that to us through your Holy Spirit, through those apostles and prophets that have written these things down. That way we can have a record of them, that we can know your mind and know what you want us to do. And especially as we've been talking about church and about how we want to be a church that is shaped by the New Testament, we are thankful that we have these things that we can help shape ourselves by. Father, help us to try to understand it with humility and with wanting to be obedient and wanting to follow after you in all that we do. Father, there are many things that are going on in this world, and there's many struggles and there's many hardships for all kinds of people, and even of our number here this morning. We ask that you be with them, be with those that are struggling with the loss of a loved one, that have had maybe those that are going through different treatments and procedures or recovering from those things, and maybe it's of a financial or an emotional nature that there is a struggle there. Help us to realize that you are a God that loves us very much and that wants what's very best for us. And we need to put our trust and our faith in you in all of these things. Father, again, we thank you so very much for your Son, Jesus. We thank you for the blood of your Son that cleansed us from our sins, that purchased your church. And Father, just watch over us and watch over the other classes that are going on at this time, and help us to be able to learn things from your word and apply those things to our lives. We ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen. All right. It is so good to continue on this morning. We've been talking about the Scripture-shaped church, and last week we started talking more about the Lord's Supper and being on the Lord's Day, and we will pick some of that stuff up in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to provide some clarity from last week too. So a lot of times when we are communicating, when there is a breakdown in understanding, A lot of times it has to do with one or two groups, one or two parties, right? It can either be the one that is the hearer or the one that is the speaker. Last week, me as the speaker, I did not do a very good job of trying to explain my understanding or explain the point that I was trying to make. And part of that is, like I said, most of that is my fault of just some misunderstanding with some stuff. So I want to try to clarify some of those things and then see if we have any other questions about it before we move on to the other material that we wanted to get to this week, okay? This Sunday. So again, the idea of the Scripture-shaped church. And one thing we were talking about was the idea of that the church comes together, that there is a coming together of the church. And we found several passages like over in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 11, 1 Corinthians and in chapter 16, Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, and so on, of the church coming together as a group, coming together as a body. And one thing that we can learn from those verses, and this is what I want to try to lay out, is the local church, no matter the size, met on the first day of the week as an assembly to worship the Lord together and to partake of the Lord's Supper. I think I maybe mis-explained some things, that in order for the church to be the church, that it needs to be a huge, large group of people. And that is not what I was trying to say at all, okay? What I'm saying is, no matter what the size of the church is, whether it be 400 people, or whether it be 40 people, or whether it be 4 people, it is the church that is coming together to worship the Lord on the first day of the week, to worship Him and also to join in this fellowship of partaking of the Lord's Supper. In my time as being a preacher, when I was a young whippersnapper, when I was in college, I would drive about an hour away from Freed-Hardeman, and I preached at the New Hope congregation. And our average attendance at the New Hope congregation was 11. 11 people. And when cousin so-and-so would come in town, we would have 12 or 13. All right? It was a very, 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 very small church, but still it was the church. It was a group of people that were coming together upon the first day of the week to try to worship God to the best of our ability. It was basically one family, the Blackwell family, and they also had Russell Dudley, who was their song leader. Russell was not only a song leader there, but he also was a barber in town, and a lot of people knew him. And the best thing about Russell is that he had a lisp, and he led singing. And he also had no idea what pitch was, or anything like that. But he could lead singing because he was up there, and he was trying to get the rest of us to sing, and all of those things. And I love Russell Dudley. He passed away about 6 or 7 years ago now. But what I'm trying to point out is that is a small group of people. But just because it is a small group of people does not make them any less the church. In the first century, we don't know what the size of the congregations were, but we do know that they met in different places. They met in public spaces, like in the temple and the temple grounds. They met around Solomon's porch, it seems to be. There was a group that was meeting there, or Solomon's porticos. They met in a school known as the School of Tyrannus, and we'll look at that verse in just a minute. And of course, they met in many homes. And that being the case, you're just going to have a limited amount of space for those different things to take place. But during the first century, there was not the forethought, nor the finances a lot of times, that where they would erect a building like we have, where multiple families would be able to come together into one large building. A lot of times they met in homes, and they met in other public spaces and other places, sometimes even rented rooms and such, where they can meet. And let's look at a couple of those passages real quick. Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3 in those public spaces, but look over in Acts in chapter 12. in verse 12. Acts in chapter 12, in verse 12. So when they had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John. This is talking about Peter after he's gotten out of prison. The angels let him out of prison. The mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. Now, while this is not technically a church service, if you will, on a Sunday, it seems to be that John Mark's mother had a house where people could gather together, and perhaps even they also had church services there, also at John Mark's mother's house. And so, again, being in homes, meeting together. Look also in chapter 19 and in verse 9. Acts chapter 19 and in verse 9. So this is after Paul has met those disciples at Ephesus and explained to them the way of the Lord, and they were baptized. And then starting in verse 9, it says, "But when some were hardened and did not believe, but spoke evil of the way before the multitude, he departed from them and withdrew the disciples, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus." All right, we do not know necessarily what that school is, but it seems to be that there was some type of building known as the school of Tyrannus where Paul met with the disciples of Ephesus after basically getting kicked out of the synagogue, and the synagogue not wanting them to meet in there anymore, and so now he's going to meet somewhere else, and so they're going to meet in the school of Tyrannus. And it seems to be that this is a daily thing as far as the teaching that was going on, but more than likely, again, I am inferring this, but more than likely they also met there on the Lord's Day as far as their worship services are concerned. Look over in Romans and in chapter 16. Romans and in chapter 16 and in verse 9. It says, "Greet Amplius, my beloved in the Lord, and greet Urbanus." Is that the one I want? Oh, verse 5. Okay, verse 5, sorry. "Likewise, greet the church that is in their house." Well, who's the there? They're talking about in verse 3, Priscilla and Aquila, and they have a church that is meeting in their house. So there is a local congregation in the church at Rome of Aquila and Priscilla that is meeting in their house, okay? So again, it's not going to be thousands of people. It's probably not going to be hundreds of people. We're talking maybe 100, more likely 20 to 50 or somewhere along those lines. Okay, look also in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 16. And I find this kind of funny. 1 Corinthians and in chapter 16, and this time verse 19. "The churches of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord with the church that is in their house." All right. So Aquila and Priscilla again are called out as they have a church that is meeting in their house. We can do some other inferences perhaps. Over in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 1, we find out that there was letters that were sent from Chloe's household to talk about the church at Corinth. So some people think that the church maybe met in the household of Chloe, in their house. And so that's why the letters are coming from that house. But there is many other places where we find out that the church is meeting in these different locations. Okay? So again, the point I'm trying to make is, like we said at the top, that a local church, no matter what the size is, met together on the first day of the week, assembling for worship, to worship the Lord together and partake of the Lord's Supper. Now let's talk about this verse that was brought up also last week. And this is where I want to try to make sure I can explain it perhaps a little bit better. Turn over to Matthew and in chapter 19, okay? Or excuse me, Matthew chapter 18 in verses 19 and 20. Matthew chapter 18, verses 19 and 20. And it says, "Again, I say to you that if two of you agree on earth concerning anything that they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. All right, something we need to make sure that we always strive to do, and this is from the least of us to the greatest of us, if you will, is to make sure we try to keep things in context of when we are talking about things. This passage in Matthew and in chapter 18 is not talking about the worship of the church. Okay? It is not talking about the worship of the church. It is talking about apostolic authority, especially authority when it comes to church discipline, and then later talking about church authority as far as church discipline is concerned. The background for this passage is over in Deuteronomy and in chapter 19 and in verse 15, where Moses is instructing the people, don't take an accusation by just one person, but instead, everything needs to be confirmed or everything needs to be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. That is the basis of it. And now in the same idea, we are talking about someone who has a fault with someone, an accusation that has a sin that they are wanting to bring up. And don't just listen to one person about it, but instead there has the idea of 2 or 3 witnesses that are going to be involved in it. So that is the context of it. Unfortunately, sometimes people can maybe use something like this. And I'm going to use an accent for this, okay? Because this is the way I want to do it. If 2 of us go fishing on a fishing trip, it's as much the church as the assembled church, right? So in other words, it doesn't matter if I'm there on church on Sunday because, me and my buddy, we're going to go fishing on Sunday. And, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, the Lord is there. So it is just as good, or it is a equivalent to the church coming together. Okay? That would be a way that passage is misused. We also need to remember that the Lord does not just suddenly appear when 2 or 3 Christians are gathered together. If you are a Christian, then the Lord is with you when? All the time. It's not like that you are by myself and I'm waiting, I need another Christian here so the Lord can be here, okay? Again, that would be misusing the passage. You have places like Hebrews and in chapter 13 and verse 5, they're talking about how that the Lord will be with you always and never forsake you. You have Romans chapter 8, verses 9 through 11, talking about the Spirit of the Lord basically indwelling the Christian, okay? So where the Christian is, then the Lord is. Or you think about other places like over in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 6. Do you not realize that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? Okay? So again, the idea that the Lord is with us, the Lord is with us always. You think about Paul. Where is this? Is it 1 Timothy or 1 Timothy, where Paul is talking to Timothy and how that at his first trial that all forsook him, that only the Lord stood with him. Okay? Again, he is saying that I was all alone, but even when I was all alone, someone was there because the Lord was with me there. Okay, so with that being said, any questions or comments that I can maybe help clarify more? Anyone? Bueller. Yes, ma'am. So what happens for people that go on a trip or something? Can they have their own little service? Okay, so there's a couple things that can take place there, and this is going to have a lot to do with conscience. I personally, what I'll tell you what my family does. Okay, this is the practice of my family. This has been the practice of my family when I was a kid. This is the practice of my family with my own kids. Is when we are traveling, if we're going to be traveling on a day that takes us away from our local congregation, okay, our local congregation is this congregation, all right, which also kind of bears out that churches, that Christians of the first century, they had their local congregation. They had a place where they worshiped, where they were locally at, if you will. Even if you think about Paul, okay? Paul, I know he was a missionary, he traveled around a lot of times, but over in Acts and in chapter 13, you find his local congregation there at Antioch. And that is the congregation that sends him and Barnabas out originally. So if I'm going to be away from my local congregation on the Lord's Day, then what we do as a family is before we go, we always usually know that we're going to be out of town on the Lord's Day. We find a place that we are going to worship at, okay? It's very, very easy nowadays because we have a thing called the internet. Before, I vividly remember in my head, my dad pulling into a hotel room and getting out the phone book and pulling up the back, right? And going through and finding the list of churches and start looking up addresses in the paper map and everything else to find out where things were. And making a phone call and waiting to hear, either to talk to somebody for real or to hear the answering machine, which the answering machine is going to tell you what time it starts, okay? And so we know when we are going to be there. Nowadays, you can do a Google search. A lot of times when we have visitors here, and we always appreciate that, who are on vacation and such, and they come to visit here, when they're filling out the visitor card, and a lot of times said, how did you hear about us? And sometimes they'll list, Google search, the internet, a website, something along those lines. So that is my practice. Now, what if you can't find a place? Then what do you do? All right, well, again, it goes a lot down to conscience sake. There was only one occasion that I remember when we were traveling that we went, this is when I was a kid, that we went to a congregation and we walked in and very quickly we realized that we were in the wrong place. And we sat there for just a few minutes. And then I remember Dad leaning over, hey, we're going to leave. What? Yeah, we're going to. And so we end up, quietly walking out. And in that time, there's all the other services we couldn't find another service at that time. So it was at that time that we missed service. Same thing that happened when someone is sick, especially before we had internet and all of those things. Sometimes you miss service. If you are with a group of people, let's for say when I was in college, many times that we would take retreats and such with my social group and things. And when we would take retreats and we knew that we were going to be gone on a Sunday, if it was a bunch of us, sometimes maybe 30 of us or so that were gone on this trip, we would pre-plan and make sure that we took some of the little communion packets with us. And we were going to have our own church service while we were there. But one thing that we realized, and one thing that we always need to realize in all of those things, is that does not replace the local assembly worship. That is something that is done because of necessity at that time. And so that's the point that I'm trying to make. Sometimes people use this passage incorrectly and say, well, I don't want to meet with the local body, so I'm going to do this instead. And that is not what this passage is talking about whatsoever. That help with that answer, maybe? Okay, good deal. Other questions? Yes, sir. Is there anything in the early church fathers about when they established a physical church building? I do not know right off the top of my head. We know that they met together. So you got to think that there is a lot of history that goes behind a lot of this stuff. And as far as how these church buildings were begun, how all that ended up happening, I know at least here in America that churches were beginning, the practice was carried over from the European settlers that came over here as far as building church buildings. But something that needs to be said sometimes, which I think is important, is when we are doing mission work and things like that in other areas, every culture does not need to have a church building. Sometimes that is not great for their culture. If they are in the habit of coming together, of meeting at some shade tree or meeting at someone's house or whatever else, we should not presume that just because we like having a church building to go to, that they would like having a church building to go to. And so there's some cultural things that we need to be aware of too when it comes to that. Yes, Calvin.
Jack and I was discussing this last Sunday after worship. When did having two services start, like morning and evening service? Because some believe that a second service is not necessary, except for maybe to help people that couldn't make the morning.
Okay. So again, the question is, when about Sunday evening? When did Sunday evening begin? And before I was born, okay, so I don't remember it. But what I understand, and again, I may be way off on this, but what I understand is the idea of Sunday evening services really began, especially during wartime, when a lot of people were having to stay and work in factories even on Sunday morning. And to give those shift opportunities, those who had to work the shift on Sunday morning and were unable to be with the brethren then, they started having another service on Sunday evening, that those individuals who missed the first shift, who missed because of their shift, could come together on Sunday evening. That is how my understanding that it began, and then it becomes a tradition like thing as far as meeting together. Obviously, we do not have the same, some people still work shifts, but we do not have the same shift structure that necessarily was done back in the 40s and 50s and before that. So, what about meeting on Sunday evening? Well, then we go to the idea of the authority of a local congregation's shepherds or eldership. The eldership has decided that it is good for us to be able to meet together on Sunday evening. We obviously do things a little bit differently here than other places. Some other time that we meet together is on Wednesday evening for Bible class. I know some congregations that meet together on Tuesday evening for that. I know some congregations that meet together on Thursday evening for that. I know some congregations that meet on Sunday morning at 8 a.m., and then they meet on Sunday morning at 11 a.m., and then they don't meet in the evening sometimes. Again, this is all about what the local congregation, as far as the eldership, is going to decide. But originally, that was the point, as far as I understand, of a Sunday evening to allow an opportunity. Of course, I've also heard it kind of said in a pithy type way that the Lord's Day is the Lord's Day all day, right? And so definitely there's nothing wrong with meeting on a certain evening. Acts chapter 20, more than likely, their church services started on Sunday evening. I know sometimes we joke as preachers that Paul preached until midnight, but more than likely he didn't start preaching until about 7 or 8 o'clock at night to begin with. He didn't start at 10 a.m. in the morning and preach all the way until midnight. More than likely, for them, Sunday was not a day off for them like we have in our culture here for the most part. They had to work on Sunday, and so they met after work on Sunday for this gathering. I saw another hand. Yes, sir, Tom. The primary purpose for Sunday evening, as far as I understand originally, was so that those people who were unable to be there on Sunday morning could be there on Sunday evening. And so that they could have the worship service, they could do all of those things. And like I was trying to say is, that is not the same necessity is not there as much today. And that's why, we still offer the Lord's Supper on Sunday night, but it is more of a focus on teaching and things like that, just like having a Sunday morning Bible class. It's the same thing. okay? We are gathered right now as a group of people on Sunday morning having a Bible class. This is not our worship time. This is our Bible class time. We will enter into a time of worship in a little while. That is the worship time of meeting together. Anything else? Yes, Calvin. Second Calvin, not you, Calvin. I know you got confused for a second. I usually say Calvin, I'm talking to you. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
I remember as a child growing up that when Sunday came around, everything shut down.
Yeah.
There was nothing available but church. Like, I don't know if you call it, forced everybody to go to church, but it was Sunday was quiet.
Yeah.
It was like a rest day, people following. What happened there? We got away from it.
Well, again, don't blame me for that. But and obviously we had those, we call them blue laws, right? So I grew up in South Carolina. South Carolina had several blue laws. I remember so much so that this is when I was in college, I was working as a youth intern at a local congregation in South Carolina. Actually, it was in South Carolina, in Fort Mill, South Carolina. I was living in Rock Hill at the time. And I had just got back from school, and I had left my belt at campus, back at school. So now I am here in South Carolina, and it's church, it's Sunday. I wake up, I'm getting dressed and all those things, and I realize I don't have a belt. And my mama raised me better than that you don't go without having a belt on. So I was going to run by Walmart real quick and get a belt. But guess what? You couldn't buy a belt because that was not a necessity. And everything at Walmart was roped off except for the necessities on Sunday morning until like noon or 1 or whatever time it was. I tried to explain to the person, no, this is a necessity right this second, but it didn't matter, okay? But we had blue laws with the secularism of countries. That happens, these things go away. And of course, there may be another argument, not to get into political, that we should not legislate different morality anyway. But beside the fact, that's what the laws used to be. Most of those laws have gone away with. Some of them still have to do with things like alcohol, whether you can buy alcohol that early or not. But yeah, a lot of places have to be until the afternoon. But yes, it used to be that Sunday was the day that all of these things happen. We see that, but in everything. When do the majority of even kids' sports happen a lot of times now? On Sundays, right? And that was never a problem me growing up playing sports, because at least where we were in our culture is that it's Sunday. Everybody's going to be going to church somewhere. And so we're not going to have those things. Yes, Neil.
So as I understand it, like in the church of Corinth, they typically met because when Paul was giving them the example of communion, he first chastised them because they were coming together in Sunday.
Yep.
Some were eating feast and some had nothing to eat. And my understanding that is there was a lot of activity Sunday morning in Corinth for purpose.
I would say that the majority of first century churches met in the evening. And again, a lot of this has to do with the necessity of it. If you're going to have people that are going to be able to come together, well, how can you have them come together when the majority of people are at work at that point in time? And the reason why a lot of them are at work is because a lot of them are of the servitude class of people. There weren't a lot of very, very wealthy people. Those that were very wealthy, though, they usually host the church in their home. Or they, like Phoebe, they helped pay for other things like the book of Romans even being written. More likely Phoebe paid for that. So, but usually they would meet on Sunday evening to have their coming together worship service. Same thing happens there in Acts chapter 22 in Troas. They meet on Sunday evening. You like that idea? On Sunday evening, okay. We'll pass that along to, what did my teacher call it? File 13? I think it's what it was called. Just kidding. Yes?
I read an article several years ago about consumerism, companies and corporations. The reason a lot of stores,
Right.
The only thing, you may find a few restaurants who open in the afternoons, like after church.
Right.
Go to dinner. But a lot of like the grocery stores, the department stores, all of that is normally closed on Sundays. But I think as the need for
Moolah.
seeing
Yep.
and the bottom line, you're starting to see these establishments that were normally closed on Sunday, opening on Sunday.
Yeah.
Because people will come and purchase things on Sunday, like, oh, well, I can sell stuff on Sundays, let me open it up.
Definitely so.
And so it became more of a bottom line thing, I can make money, so let me open on Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, if the world's going to find a way to make money, they're going to find a way to make money, right? And there's very few places that are not open on Sunday, aka Chick-fil-A. Would not always want it too. No, just kidding. But a lot of places are closed during that time for that. But then as one place opens up, and then the other owners of other places like, oh, look how much business they're having on Sunday. We're going to do that also. But it wasn't too terribly long ago that on Sunday for Sunday lunch or for Sunday dinner, where would that take place? At grandma's house, right? At mom's house. Well, what are we going to do? We're all getting together. Or you're doing it on the church grounds, right? Because people are bringing things. Now it is the normal thing to do is to go out to eat somewhere, because a lot of times that's just the normal thing to do, and maybe a meal is not being prepared and all of that kind of stuff. All right. Yes, Castillo.
I know when we're talking about a lot of these things, we're at the intersection of culture, and then we're also talking about whether we have it on Sunday nights or Wednesdays and things like that, and we're talking about the eldership,
Right.
having that. So I guess my question is, how do we teeter that line so that culture doesn't supersede, scripture?
Right.
Because that can easily happen, and I think that's the reason why we have so many differences today.
It definitely can be a part of it. The church is above culture, and many times is counter culture. But at the same time, it acts within a culture. Okay, and so I think that's just where wise counsel, where smart decisions can take place, and that's the same thing that we see that's happening even in the first century a lot of times. You think about Paul, okay? So Paul's MO is when he would first go into a area is that the first place that he would start preaching is where? Does anybody happen to know? In the synagogue, okay? Culturally, the synagogue is its own culture. It's a very, very important culture. And in fact, that's why it's so bad in John chapter 9 and other places for people to be kicked out of the synagogue, because that would be kicking you out of your culture. But that's where Paul would first start. He would start there. Then other times, once he was out of that, then he would start in the marketplace and things. Sometimes he would be where the culture was of the meeting. There was ladies that were meeting in Philippi by the river, and he would meet with them there. So the idea is to help work within culture and help shape culture, and not let the culture supersede the authority. And you're right, it can be a balancing act sometimes. It can be trying to understand different people's sensibilities and such to try to bring the message across. Another thing I think about is what Paul says over in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 9, where it talks about how that depending on basically the different group of people that he was talking to, he became like them, right? To those who were under the law, he looked like one that was under the law. To those who were without law, he became as one that was without law, right? And his whole point was he did those things so that he might be able to win some for Christ. That's 1 Corinthians and in chapter 9, starting around verse 12 or so, running through 20. Yes?
I think what you're saying is sometimes we get our traditions and the way it was done. I remember when the blue laws were lifted. I know you're too young to do that, but I worked at a grocery store.
Yeah.
And there were some people who would not come
Yep.
Sunday. Now we were, and it was like, this is anti-God.
Definitely. Yeah. There's when it comes to changing something that is a tradition, anytime there's change, there's going to be pushback, there's going to be upsetness about things. And that happens whether it be with church stuff or, or you change a logo for a restaurant. There's going to be pushback about things, and sometimes people not knowing the full situation of what's going on with all of that too. All right. I do not know how long we've talked about this because the clock's not working back there. So, all right. We'll take another minute or two, and then we'll move on to the rest of the stuff that I had prepared for this. Yes, Calvin 1. Okay.
This is something that I've heard happen in a few cases, not often, but what if you have a small town where several ladies have been baptized and they're members, but there's no men?
Yep.
Can ladies lead a worship service?
Yeah.
All women?
Yeah. So the question is, if there is a place where there is a congregation, small area or whatever, where it's all women, how does that work? And that's where women are going to lead those things. And in my opinion, women are going to lead those things even when there are men that are there that are not part of the body, that they are going to lead those things. If I remember the history of this congregation correctly, is that originally it was started by a few women meeting in their home somewhere not too far from where we are right now, is how this congregation originally started 100-something years ago now. So that is kind of how it happens. Now, something else that happens, and when I was in college again, and I remember visiting a very small church, and I just happened to show up there and visit, and I ended up being one of the only men there. I ended up doing everything that day. I did the singing, and I did the praying, and I did the communioning, and I did all the things because they were like, oh, well, look. Oh, you go to Freed Hardeman? You're a member of the church? Okay, well, now have at it. And so that's how it happens too. Yes?
We ran into this in a military congregation overseas during the First Gulf War because we had so many men deployed.
Yeah.
There was at least one church that was almost all women because this came up. Our church, we had one or two. You were deployed for a little bit of that, but there were times when it was the Dale show.
Yeah.
Or whoever happened to be
Right.
there.
Definitely so.
It does happen,
It-
once again, it goes back to conscience and then following what the Bible says. But
I definitely agree with that. And that sometimes that happens. It is very rare that happens, but sometimes that may happen. Yes, ma'am.
in regards to taking communion,
Mm-hmm.
and I bring the guys with me to the Church of Christ the first time, I'm not used to taking communion, and they go to grab to take communion.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is, should I deter them for that, or does it not matter?
Okay, good question. So, I'm glad that we are moving on to something that we were kind of getting to. Okay, so in talking about communion, okay, so the Lord's Supper is for Christians to remember the Lord's death for them and the saving blood that is this, I shed this blood for the remission of your sins type things, okay? Now, we do not practice what is sometimes referred to as closed communion, as far as if someone is visiting who is not a member of the Lord's church and they start to take communion, I am not running up there and smacking it out of their hand or anything like that. But let's think about the difference, okay? When I was a kid, again, I'm sorry I'm using so many kid stories, but when I was a kid, sometimes my mom would be in charge of making the communion, okay? We made the bread at our house and things, and I loved those weeks because it always smelled so good, and it also meant that I got all the extra. And so there was a lot of times that my sister and I, that when our family was in charge of communion, that means that after services that we would have the job of cleaning up stuff. And so we would go and we would take the leftover bread and we would eat it because it was good and we liked it. It's a lot better than what we had in the little cups, right? So we liked it. When we partook of that bread, guess what we were doing? We were just eating some bread, okay? And the same thing is true when someone who comes in, as far as who is not a member of the Lord's church, who has not been baptized for their remission of their sins, for them to eat of it, I think it's great that maybe they can be thinking about spiritual things, and perhaps that is a lead-in for us to start having an evangelistic conversation about, do you understand what you are doing? But I don't, if I have a visitor with me, I do not necessarily give them it. I let them ask questions if they want to. Of course, it's different now because you kind of have to like pick it up or somebody's going to give it to you. It's not like when we used to pass it around and then there was that decision. And sometimes when I had visitors, you could see it going through their head like, yeah, exactly. What am I doing? Should I do this or not? That type of thing. And a lot of times in that kind of situation, I said, you don't have to do this. And we'll pass it on. So does that help answer that question at all? Okay. So it's not closed communion, but it's closed communion in that it's for somebody else, it's just a little piece of bread and a little sip of grape juice. But for the Christian, it's a very, very important meal that we're going to have 10 minutes to talk a very little bit about. But do you have another comment? Okay. All right, so no Lord's Day without the Lord's Supper, and no Lord's Supper without the Lord's Day is kind of a saying that has been said. It's not my saying. It's something that I have read before. So let's talk a little bit about the Lord's Supper. And we've been talking thus far about the time frame that it happens upon the Lord's Day. But something we need to get into our head and understand is just having the timing right does not make it right, okay? Just because you are doing it on the first day of the week does not mean that it suddenly is the correct thing to do, okay? Look over in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 11. 1 Corinthians and in chapter 11. And we'll be back and forth here a lot. But verse 20 says, "Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper." And the way that is said, the idea is that you should be coming together in one place to eat the Lord's Supper. But the supper you're eating is not the Lord's Supper. You're doing your own thing. And so remember, even just by it saying the Lord's Supper, it's the supper that belongs to Him. It's His supper. He makes the rules for that supper. Just as when you used to go to your grandma's house, she made the rules for her supper, right? And if you were supposed to do this verse or that verse, and that's what you're going to do because it's hers. Same thing in a much more important way. It is the Lord's Supper. Look over in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 10, just on the other side of the page there, in verse 21. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. Again, the idea that this is, and we even refer to this as the Lord's table a lot of times. It is His supper, it is His, and so because it is His, He gets to make the rules, if you will, or give the guidelines around the Lord's Supper. So just because we have it at the right time does not necessarily mean that we are doing it with the right spirit in the right way. And so we're going to try. So we're just going to cover one more thing, and then we'll have some time for questions perhaps, and we'll cover the rest of this next week, Lord willing. Part of the Lord's Supper is thanksgiving, okay, is thanksgiving. Let's look at a couple of these passages. There's not time to look at all of them. Look over in Matthew and in chapter 26. Matthew and in chapter 26. This is Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper. And in verse 27, it says, "And then He took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you.'" Okay? It says that He gave thanks. think about that word there for a second. Okay, turn over to Mark and in chapter 14. Mark and in chapter 14. This is Mark's version of the same account there in verse 23. It says, then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they said, drink, and they drank from it. Okay, and the same thing is used in Luke chapter 22. The same thing is used in 1 Corinthians in chapter 11, is that this is a time of thanksgiving. That word, give thanks, that's where we don't usually use this term right here, but the term the Eucharist. Okay, a lot of times in different groups, they refer to the Lord's Supper as the Eucharist. That is a transliteration of the Greek word that means thanks. Because Jesus, during the time of the Lord's Supper, he gave thanks. And so one of the things that we do when we take of the Lord's Supper, just because you're doing it on Sunday morning, if you're not doing it with the idea of a thankful heart, then we are missing part of the main point, is that we should be giving thanks. We should be thankful for this time together. Okay? Next week, we're also going to look at the idea of what the word communion. We're going to think about memorial, and we're also going to think about covenant in some other things that are there. Okay? But I'm afraid that we're not going to have enough time for all of that. So, any other questions or comments, or open it up for anything that we have talked about this morning or something else? Yes, ma'am.
One situation
Uh-huh.
that we are doing now,
Yeah.
and I'm just going to say I don't like it.
Okay.
And
We'll put you down for a don't like. Okay.
That is, we do not have individual time to reflect
Okay.
during the Lord's Supper.
Right.
Here's the cup, here's the bread, here's the cup.
Yeah.
It's just bang, bang. And about the time you start to pray, give thanks, reflect on the death and burial and resurrection of Christ, they're into
Yeah.
giving or whatever,
Right.
It bothers me that we do not have that time to reflect.
Right.
I don't care if it's handed out. I don't care if it's in the cup. I just like the idea for a few minutes personally
Right.
to reflect.
Definitely so. So I get that. I totally get that. And one of the things that is a benefit as far as actually passing trays is you have that built-in buffer time, right? That it takes a little bit of time for this person all the way back there and then for us to do something again, okay? Many times the individuals that are leading, I think they are doing their very level best sometimes to give the opportunity after they have had the prayer for the bread and we partake of that, or after we have the prayer for the cup and we partake of that, to give some buffer time. I do encourage that during the time, a lot of times when they are doing the reflection, where we are reading the verse, where they are talking about different things about the verse or about Lord's Supper, to use that opportunity as that too. But I also want you to keep in mind that a lot of times the men that are up here doing this, like I said, are doing their very, very best. And one of the scariest things for someone that is up leading a congregation is dead silence. See? See how scary that was? Okay? And so a lot of times they are done and obviously, like I said, they're doing their best, and it's like, okay, well, we've done this, now I need to move on. Sometimes what I encourage them to make it awkward, right? Because if they're just standing up there, then it's going to be awkward for them. Let the silence be awkward. Sometimes they may even come and sit down for a second to add some more time. It's just, I think people are trying to do their very best. But yes, a part of the Lord's Supper is a time of reflection, of thanksgiving, of these other things we're going to look at. Just one second. We come over here. Tasha, yes.
Back to what you were saying about those that are not baptized
Mm-hmm.
and partaking in the Lord's Supper. I think in 1 Corinthians 11, where you were at, but verse 28 through about So the scriptures is clear on whether you should partake in that Lord's Supper or not.
Okay, so over in 1 Corinthians in chapter 11, and we'll have a slide about this next week too, but where it talks about that eating and drinking unworthily. It is not talking about the actual eating and drinking. It is talking about the eating and drinking, okay? And what I mean by that is this in verse 28. Therefore, whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup. What in the context are we talking about? We're talking about those who are partaking of the Lord's Supper, and they take it in an unworthy manner. Well, what does it mean to be in an unworthy manner? It's the idea that you are taking it not with the fellowship and not with discerning the body the way you're supposed to. Because even says, unworthy man will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat and drink of the cup. For whoever eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats or drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. And so the idea there is that you are not discerning the body of the Lord. As far as the church here, this is a command to Christians about how they are supposed to take the Lord's Supper. And the reason why I say that we're not talking about those who are outside of the church, because this is not written to those who are outside the church. They are not partaking of the Lord's Supper. They are eating of a piece of bread and a thing of grape juice. That's all it is to them. Same thing if a kid grabs it and partakes of it. That's all it is to them. But to me, it is a representation of the body that died for me and the blood that was shed for me. So that is my understanding of that this is directed to Christians. Same way that things over in 1 Corinthians 5 are directed to Christians. Or when Paul explains in 2 Corinthians and in chapter 5, I wrote these things to you that you may not have fellowship with that brother. I'm not saying you can't have fellowship with the world in general, because if that was the case, then you'd have to be out of the world. And so it is an instruction that is given to the church. Castillo.
Yeah, whenever we have these type of conversations, I look at it from a lens where maybe some of our other religious friends, like I didn't grow up in the church.
Yeah.
So the idea of taking communion weekly was something that was new to me.
Mm-hmm.
Where I grew up, we did it maybe on first Sunday, it was a
Right.
once a month thing. And then when I started, really started to like Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Hope you still do.
still do.
Good. Okay.
But reading the scriptures and things of that nature and understanding, I had the conversation with my minister at the time and asking, why don't we have communion on every Sunday?
Right.
And it was explained to me by him saying that they didn't want to take away the sacredness
Right.
of it or things of that nature.
Yeah.
Whether that's a good excuse or not following that. However, I'm curious to know, is there a historical point, I guess, in a sense where I'm thinking maybe there's Reformation or something of that nature where that idea of taking it weekly to maybe people misinterpreting that and doing it what they think.
Yeah, I don't know when that started happening. A lot of times, a lot of things are with good intentions in mind a lot of times. But what's the saying is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And there may be good intentions involved in that. But if we partake of the Lord's Supper the way that we're supposed to take of the Lord's Supper, then it's not going to become something that is rote. It's not going to become something that is not any less sacred because we are keeping it sacred or set apart, which that word sacred means. We are keeping it set apart as far as the way we're going to be taking it. And next week, hopefully, we will be able to discuss some more things with all of that. But that's a good question. So hold all of your other questions you may have about the Lord's Supper, and Lord willing, we will get to discuss some of those next week. We are now out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and let's have a quick prayer, and then we will dismiss. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful for this day. We're thankful for the time we've had to study your word. Help us always strive to follow your word to the best of our ability. Be with us. Be gracious upon us in our misunderstanding and our ignorance, and help us to truly love you and try to obey you and love those that are around us. Watch over us as we enter in this time of worship, and help us to come before your throne of grace and mercy with a heart, worshiping you in spirit and in truth, with the right heart, with the right actions in all that we do. It's in your Son's